There's a common misconception that the best comic book adaptations are the ones most faithful to the source material. But if you study the shows of the DC animated universe, you quickly realise its genius lay in not how much it kept, but in what it had the courage to throw away. Faced with the constraints of kid-friendly television and 22-minute runtimes, creators like Bruce Timm, Paul Dini, Rich Fogel and their teams became masters of the narrative edit. They understood that decades of comic book continuity, stretching across multiple reboots, spin-off and creative handoffs, often resulted in stories that were way too bloated to breathe. The DCAU's signature trick was taking these incredibly convoluted storylines, stripping them down to their raw emotional essence, and rebuilding them into sleek cinematic shows. And a fantastic example of this is the Justice League two-parter, In Blackest Night. For casual viewers, In Blackest Night is just a cool, ominous-sounding superhero title. But for fans of the wider DC universe, it's the punchline to a setup that started years prior. Back in Superman the Animated Series, the episode that introduced the Green Lantern Kyle Rayner was titled In Brightest Day, the opening of the Green Lantern's Oath. It took years for the DCAU to finally give us the second half, In Blackest Night. And while the Superman story detailed the triumphant rise of the Green Lanterns, this story charts one of their darkest moments. On the surface, it is a straightforward action-heavy story about John Stewart going on trial for planetary genocide. But to appreciate just how brilliantly the animators streamlined this narrative, you first have to understand the absolute madness of the source material they were working with. To say that the comic book history of the Manhunters is convoluted is a massive understatement. It is a dizzying decades-long spiral of retroactive continuity that transforms them from the Guardians' original android peacekeepers into a literal globe-spanning Earth cult. After they concluded no organic life equals no crime and went on a rampage, the Guardians banished their former tools. But many of them survived and went into hiding, swearing vengeance against their creators and their Green Lantern replacements. From there, the Manhunters spent centuries masquerading as organic beings across the cosmos, establishing a secret cult on Earth. This cult manipulated unwitting human agents into becoming red and blue-clad costumed vigilantes, most notably a 1940s big game hunter named Paul Kirk, who was cloned after his death, told you it was convoluted, and a hero named Mark Shaw who became a double-agent villain called the Privateer. The absurdity peaked during the 1980s Millennium crossover event, which revealed that these undercover space robots had infiltrated the everyday lives of Earth's superheroes. It's a wildly overcomplicated narrative web of secret clones, ancient massacres, mythological imposters, and cult brainwashing. Now, the comic book story this two-parter is based on is steeped deep in that sprawling saga. After Hal Jordan was tricked into believing he had accidentally destroyed a densely populated planet, he was tracked down by the Manhunters, the human cult on Earth. They acted like they had been hired by the intergalactic community to bring the Green Lantern to justice, but in reality they had infiltrated those societies and turned the population against the Guardians of the Universe as part of a centuries-old revenge scheme. Really, they had just hidden the planet, which was secretly their home base. What's more, when the Justice League solved the case and came to face with the Grand Master, they learned he was actually a robot manipulating everyone. So with that in mind, it makes the animated series' decision to just keep the perpetrators as rogue, power-hungry robots look like a stroke of absolute genius. The core premise is the same though. John Stewart surrenders to face charges of interplanetary genocide. The animated version strips away all of the unnecessary parts, mostly the Earthbound side plot about uncovering the cult's secret, and the Flash and Wonder Woman getting trapped on the JLA satellite, and really gets to the emotional core of the mystery. This is a story about guilt, duty, and institutional loyalty. But to really understand how the show explores institutional loyalty, you have to look at the massive contrast between how John's two families react to his alleged crime. On one side you have the Green Lantern Corps. This is a massive, highly disciplined, intergalactic peacekeeping force, but the second John is accused of genocide, most of them don't rally to find the truth. They instead abandon him to protect the brand of the Corps. To them, John is a PR nightmare and a stain on their uniform, and when Hawkgirl confronts them, they call him a disgrace. It's a biting critique of how large institutions will ruthlessly sacrifice the individual to protect the system. Of course, the only exceptions here were most of the Guardians in Kilowog. On the other side, you have the Justice League. Now, keep in mind, this is Season 1. These heroes barely know each other at this point. They're a ragtag group of Earth protectors who have only been working together for a hot minute, yet their loyalty to John is unconditional. The show demonstrates this through action and not just words. Flash, the youngest or at the very least the least experienced member of the team, steps up to be John's defense attorney despite being warned that if John is sentenced to death, he too will be executed. And then you have Hawkgirl, who gets so furiously protective of her teammate that she literally takes on 4 Green Lanterns at once, beating them without even using her nth metal mace. Superman and the Martian Manhunter, meanwhile, investigate the scene of the crime. It's a beautiful, character-defining contrast. The cold, ancient, bureaucratic institution immediately casts John out, while his brand new, chaotic chosen family is willing to die for him. But while the League is operating on pure heart, the masterminds behind the curtain are playing a much more cold and calculating game. The twist in the story, that this was all a ploy by the Manhunters to lure the Guardians off of Oa, is a smart streamlining of the comic book story. This conflict works so well because the Manhunters are both a physical threat to the Guardians and a psychological mirror for John Stewart himself. The Guardians' fatal mistake with the Manhunters was building them without the capacity to see the grey area between right and wrong, forcing them to operate on a rigid, binary algorithm of absolute justice. When John is accused of destroying a Juris 4, he succumbs to the exact same mechanical rigidity. Blinded by overwhelming guilt and his strict military conditioning, John shuts down his own humanity and reduces his situation to a cold mathematical equation. A catastrophic mistake was made, and therefore he must be erased. By refusing to defend himself and passively allowing a kangaroo court to sentence him to death, John operates like an emotionless machine. He becomes as unyielding, unforgiving, and blind to nuance as the Manhunters are. Although actually I should correct myself a little there. Yes, the Manhunters are immune to nuance, but they're far from emotionless. They feel a deep sense of betrayal at the hands of the Guardians. As far as they were concerned, they were punished just for doing their jobs, and being decommissioned by the Guardians, who simply saw them as tools and not individuals in their own right, deeply offended them. If the Guardians wouldn't acknowledge their right to exist, then they would oust them and take control of their central power battery for themselves. So while the universe's attention is on John and the League proves his innocence, the Manhunters attack. And the surprising thing is that their plan actually succeeds. The Manhunters are able to breach Oa's defences. Once there, their leader makes his way to the central power battery. Now, rather than taking it under his control, he instead becomes one with the power that lives inside of it. So you'd think that this is game over for the Lanterns, but John's solution to this problem is pretty simple. He recites his Green Lantern oath and absorbs the Manhunter into his ring. On the surface, it might feel like a bit of an anticlimax, but I argue that it makes a very important point. When you look at it through a psychological lens, this entire sequence serves as a metaphor for processing negative feelings like guilt and inadequacy and reclaiming personal agency. For the first half of this story, John is entirely passive. He retreats to his old neighbourhood in shame, refuses to speak in his own defence, and lets a broken, rigid system dictate his fate. He effectively allows this shame to crush him from the outside. But by choosing to physically absorb the Manhunter's energy into his ring, John finally stops letting his trauma happen to him. He takes control of the situation. It is the ultimate visual representation of standing face to face with your darkest, heaviest burdens, opening your arms and deciding to take total ownership of them rather than letting them destroy you. This is exactly why his sudden recitation of the Green Lantern Oath is so powerful and strangely moving, or at least I thought it was. Throughout his trial, John was pretty much voiceless. He didn't even offer his own defense because he believed he deserved to be executed. Shouting the oath amidst a storm of corrupt cosmic power is the precise moment he finds his voice again and reminds himself who he is. And what I really like about this ending is how John doesn't escape his ordeal through a legal loophole or just punch his way to a happy ending. Instead, he absorbs the harshest, most rigid judgment the universe can throw at him, filters it through the lens of human nuance and the unconditional loyalty of his friends, forcing it to become clean. He transforms himself from a passive prisoner of his own mind into the absolute master of his destiny, proving that we aren't defined by the cold verdicts of a rigid world, but by the strength of our convictions when we are pushed to the absolute brink. So yeah, I think it's a pretty good ending, especially when compared to the comic book source material. After John saves the day, the other Green Lanterns, who had spent the entire trial calling him a disgrace, sheepishly try to apologise and welcome him back. In a lesser cartoon, John would have smiled, accepted their apology, and we'd get a cheesy lesson about forgiveness. But John firmly brushes them off and walks away. He doesn't offer easy forgiveness to the institution that abandoned him. He knows exactly who stood by him when his back was against the wall, and he chooses to leave Oa with his true friends. In Blackest Night could have easily been a tangled mess of secret societies, hidden bases, and convoluted sci-fi scenarios. Instead, by cutting the fat, the writers built a story where every single sequence, plot twist, and character interaction points towards the same fundamental truth, that real justice requires human nuance, not rigid, unyielding systems. It took a bloated, decades-long comic book continuity and distilled it into a deeply personal story about overcoming overwhelming guilt, reclaiming your own voice, and learning who your real family is. And in that sense, it showed the power of an adaptation. You don't have to slavishly replicate every scene or line of dialogue. Really, you should get to the heart of the story and just take it from there. Now, I know some people are going to push back on this idea, but I argue, what is the point of taking that same exact story and just translating it from the page to the screen? Doesn't make much sense to me. But let me know what you think in the comments below. Share your views about what you prefer. A straight-up adaptation or something that is true to the spirit of the material. Special thanks to my channel members whose names have been scrolling by on screen for a little while now. They help to make these videos possible. If you want to see your name on screen in future videos and get early access to all of my upcoming video essays, then join the channel now. Thanks for watching, everybody. Don't forget to like, share, comment, subscribe, and tell all your friends about me. See you next time.